Let's discuss now with MS Now legal affairs reporter Fallon Gallagher. Our justice and intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian is in Washington, and MS Now legal analyst and former U.S. attorney Barb McQuade. Fallon, starting with you. The DOJ had to submit this legally required explainer to Congress. What was in it?
Yeah, members of Congress are really upset about this report because not only is it very detail light, it's overdue. This report was supposed to be produced 15 days after that deadline to release all of the files. You'll remember that December was December 19th. They missed that deadline. Now, this did come 15 days after they did release all those documents at the end of January, but it's still late. It's very detailed light. It was supposed to include 3 major categories, the first being the categories of all files in this, including the categories of types of files that they withheld. It's also supposed to lay out the redactions and the legal basis for those redactions. And then it's supposed to include this list of government and politically facing people who are mentioned in the files. Now, for those first 2 categories, it's pretty light on the details. In the redactions category, it talks about how they withheld and redacted material related to ongoing investigations. Now, we still don't have any information into who or what those investigations may be into. But the part of this list that's getting the most buzz is that list of names. And there are 300 names of people who are mentioned in the Epstein files. And some of them are people who we've been talking about a lot. But some of them are people who just blatantly don't make sense. You see names like Janis Joplin, Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe. These are people who, in some cases, died before Epstein was even an adult and had no direct ties with him, apparently. And so these names are all there, and members of Congress are really upset about this. You heard Ro Khanna saying that this long list of 300 names is an attempt to muddy the waters because this includes people who could be predators, but also could just be mentioned in an email once here or there. And I want to be really clear about this list of names. None of these people who are not named Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell have been criminally charged.
So to that point, Barb, what happened here? Did the DOJ just do some kind of, word search and find a bunch of names and dump them into a document? What does politically exposed even mean here?
Yeah, it's the language that we got in the statute was that no name should be withheld for political exposure and that they should be included. But as we see all of these, news commentators, even Maureen Comey, who is one of the prosecutors on the case, is named, it really does feel like this effort to do exactly what Big Tobacco did back in the day when it was involved in litigation. And that was to do such a huge document dump of all kinds of irrelevant things that it was very difficult to find the needle in the haystack. But I think that, Congress is not without recourse. They have the ability to call Todd Blanche as a witness. Perhaps they should even call Maureen Comey, who was the lead prosecutor on the Ghislaine Maxwell case, and ask them about some of these decisions. One of the things that remains redacted that I think is most concerning is the reports of interview of the victims. Certainly their names should be removed and their personal information, but we have pages and pages. What's contained there? Are those reports about the conduct of some of these individuals? Because that, I think, is what is missing.
Ken, Republican Congressman Thomas Massie has been at the forefront of all of this. He's been outspoken throughout this process of trying to get the Epstein files made public. But yesterday, he leveled some of his harshest criticism of the DOJ, specifically Pam Bondi, that we've heard yet. Here he was on ABC.
Do you still have confidence in Pam Bondi as Attorney General?
I don't think Pam Bondi has confidence in Pam Bondi. She wasn't confident enough to engage in anything but name-calling in a hearing. And so, no, I don't have confidence in her. Donald Trump told us that even though, he had dinner with these kinds of people in New York City and West Palm Beach, that he would be transparent, but he's not. He's still in with the Epstein class. This is the Epstein administration.
The Epstein administration. Ken, how's the DOJ responding?
Well, they would label Thomas Massie as a conspiracy theorist, and Harmeet Dillon, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, posted on X that Massie and his Democratic allies are essentially putting political expediency and clicks over justice and due process and making fools of themselves in the process. And in fairness to them, if they did call Maureen Comey to the stand, to Barb's point, Maureen Comey would likely say what the FBI found, according to a document that has been released as part of this dump, which is that they found no evidence that Epstein was trafficking women to other men. So the charges that Massey and the Democrats are making, that there are people who should have been prosecuted, that this Justice Department is covering up for, we have not seen evidence to support that. And don't take this Justice Department's word for it. Take the Biden Justice Department's word for it. They're the ones that presided over this investigation, and they concluded that there was no one else to be prosecuted. That's a separate question from whether people acted inappropriately and were morally compromised because they befriended Epstein after they knew he was a sex offender. But the idea, as Democrats have been saying and Massey has been saying, that there are other men who should have been prosecuted, we've not seen the evidence to support that yet. Ariel.
So, Barb, the Epstein Files Transparency Act merely says that the AG had to submit, quote, a list of all government officials and politically exposed persons named or referenced in the released materials. But they dropped those 300 names, as we've been discussing, with absolutely no context. Did the DOJ meet this obligation set out by lawmakers, or was it so nebulous that they've somehow met this requirement? Should Congress have written this law better?
A little of both, I think, but just because Congress wrote a law once doesn't mean it doesn't have the ability to go back and again revise it again. One of the things that I think is missing from all of this is the deliberative processes of the Justice Department. They have withheld those documents on the basis that those are protected by executive privilege. But of course, the Epstein Files Transparency Act was very explicit in the kinds of materials that could be redacted. It said only, the names of victims and survivors, anything that might threaten the national security, and anything relating to an ongoing investigation. Instead, the Justice Department took it on its own to withhold these deliberative process documents. And that's where we would see decision making. Why did Alex Acosta give Epstein such a sweetheart deal when he was in Florida? What other people were considered for a criminal investigation, and that was dropped? One of the reasons that could be important is even if the evidence does not amount to a crime, it could be of value to a survivor who might want to sue someone civilly.
So, Fallon, Congressman Robert Garcia says the House Oversight Committee really wants to talk to UK Ambassador Peter Mandelson and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, of course, the former prince, his title stripped away due to all of this controversy. Can Congress summon figures from outside of the U.S. to testify? How does that work?
Long answer or short answer, no, they can't. This is very difficult. So Congress has really limited authority over what they can do with foreign nationals. They cannot compel those people to come here and testify. In fact, they've already tried. Last fall, as you mentioned, Prince Andrew, they asked him to come and testify. That request has gone ignored. This is completely voluntary. So there's still a possibility that they could come testify, but they would have to be willing to come here and do that on their own volition. It seems highly unlikely that that will happen.
Highly unlikely for sure. Ken, do we have any more insider information about the new Epstein investigation that the DOJ is apparently launching or launched last year before the files came out?
Ariel, I've asked sources at the Justice Department about this, and what I've gotten back is they don't believe that really anything is happening in that investigation. It really seems more like a political sop to sort of suggest to the public who is clamoring for some kind of action on this matter that they're doing something, that they're investigating potential other criminality, when, again, we've seen no evidence in these files of unprosecuted criminality, and the Justice Department really doesn't seem to be conducting an actual investigation. Remember, they said it was about Democrats and Democratic misconduct. They don't even seem to be looking into that, Ariel.
So, Barb, despite the bumpy rollout of these files and some of the missteps made by the DOJ, we are seeing powerful people face consequences for their association with Epstein, from royal titles, as we just mentioned, to resignations at the top of universities, law firms, investment banks. And I do want to remind most, if not all of these people have denied any wrongdoing, but the only criminal probes so far are the ones that we've seen initiated overseas. Are you surprised that we aren't seeing more investigative developments here? Or, as Ken mentioned, there isn't any window into criminality at this point in those files?
Yeah, there have been some certainly very embarrassing disclosures made about email messages that people had with Jeffrey Epstein, certainly showing more than even poor judgment, in my view, acceptance of someone who was already known to be a convicted child predator. And so for those reasons, I can understand why organizations would no longer want to be associated with these individuals. But that is different from criminal conduct. I think that one of the things that we have not delved into is what's behind some of those redaction bars, and I think it would be useful to see some of those things. It does seem that in other countries there is perhaps a higher level of shame for some of these people. You know, we still have individuals in our cabinet, for example, who were having affiliations with Jeffrey Epstein even after his disclosure of being a known child predator. And it seems that there are people in the United States who don't have the same sort of shame, perhaps, that we see in other societies where people recognize that they no longer have sort of the moral authority to lead in their organizations.
Well, we know that some lawmakers have gone to the DOJ to see what's behind those redaction bars, but it remains to be seen whether we, the public, will see it. Barb, the DOJ seems to have closed the book on this, said that this is the end of the Epstein files saga. Do you think it ends here? Where does it go from here?
Well, in some ways, that's a helpful development for survivors, because as long as there's a pending criminal investigation, that is a basis for declining to disclose materials under the Freedom of Information Act. Now that if the book is indeed closed on criminal investigations, that could enable some of the survivors to use a FOIA request to obtain all of the information about them or about the investigation. We may still see some redactions, but since this is not a public disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act, they would only be able to protect those very specific statutory areas that are entitled to protection. So that might be the next step for some of these survivors, which could yet lead to civil liability for some of the people who are involved with Jeffrey Epstein.
So certainly not the end here. Fallon Gallagher, Ken Dilanian, and Barbara McQuade, thank you all so much for your insights and reporting.